strategy-focused group. We not only upskill, we inspire, enable, educate, discuss, innovate, motivate, challenge, let us help you elevate your team. Email us at info@strategyfocusedgroup.com.
Identify and book the world's best speakers for your next event. MENA Speakers is the leading speakers and MC bureau in the Middle East. We bring global talent to the region and have established the region as a key global hub for speakers. Inspire and motivate your audience. Find exactly what you are looking for by working closely with us to assist you in understanding the cost-benefit analysis tied to selecting a speaker for any event. Ensure that your audience is educated, engaged, and empowered. Connect with us for a quick response and tailored advice. Book your speakers now.
Good morning, good evening, depending upon what part of the world you're in. If it's Friday, it's the CEO series, where we bring together global leaders, entrepreneurs, innovators, and disruptors. Our guest today is Dr. Christal Morris, Global Head of Diversity, Global Head of DEI of Peleton, and the founder of CLM and Associates. She has led inclusion and diversity strategies for many leading organizations and started CLM Associates to help small organizations with less than 5,000 employees with their training needs. She's responsible for implementing diversity strategy for 40,000 employees, affecting 40,000 employees, and delivering DEI solutions globally across 120 countries and over 100 offices. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. I've always been, as I told you earlier, I've always been a fan from afar, looking at the work that you've been doing, and I'm glad that you were able to squeeze in some time for us to talk this morning. So, as sitting at the top of DEI, because when you look at news today, specifically in the space that we're in, the DEI buzzword is all over the place. You can't read an article unless DEI is a component of that. And I wonder sometimes whether it's just window dressing, and how can we move from a so-called buzzword to really making a difference in an organization?
Yeah, great question, Ron. And again, thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here today and spend some time with you. It is a buzzword. You can't turn on the news without hearing it in politics, without hearing it around corporations, around social justice. It is the buzzword of the day. I've been doing this work since 2006 with a formal title of Director of Diversity before it became popular. And I've watched many organizations hire diversity leaders. However, they weren't really set up for success in some cases, or companies have created these lofty statements around diversity, but maybe had homogenous leadership teams or homogenous boards. So I believe wholeheartely that diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're table stakes. It must it doesn't have a need to have it in everyone's role. There is a need to have it as a part of everyone's role in an organization, with equity being kind of the foundation by which inclusion and diversity thrive. So if you believe in equitable experiences, equitable exposure for everyone in the organization, not just a chosen few or your favorites, then diversity, equity, and inclusion should be important to you. So there's 5 things I like to kind of think about when I think about these things. You can't do one-time training, the one and done training, right? It will not stick. It needs to be built into your strategy. You can't hire a diversity leader and not prepare a pathway for them to influence decisions. Diversity needs to be a topic the board discusses and on the agenda of the CEO. It's window dressing if it's not, right? If it's buried down 4 or 5 levels below the top executive in the organization, you're not taking it seriously. I've actually seen that written in an employee survey once. If you're winning awards and appearing on lists, but your internal employees feel that they are being treated inequitably, it's window dressing. And, take action. So for your shareholders, if you have them, your consumers, members, customers, and your internal employees, the way that you activate DEI as a company impacts the workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace. So if you're not doing some of these things I just described, then you are checking a box. It might be more compliance driven, and it's going to end up looking and even feeling from an internal employee experience perspective like window dressing.
And that's why you mentioned that employee survey came back and said it was all fluff. It was all kind of window dressing. So if we think of that, a lot of these initiatives came out as a result of George Floyd. Now you've been doing this 2006 because I'm calculating this back. And what was I doing in 2006? Never even heard of diversity mentioned inside of the corporate lexicon. Never even thought of that during that time because I knew exactly where I was during that time. I was at Martha Stewart, and I was the only person that looked like me as a part of the leadership team.
Yeah.
And it was not discussed as to whether we need to bring more people or how do we increase the level of inclusion.
Right. Yeah, so, I'm pleased that I was at a progressive at the time organization, Time Warner Cable, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now called Spectrum. But I was a part of an organization that from a media and cable communication standpoint believed in representation, what images are on TV, how do we make sure we're providing solutions and channels that people want to watch. So I was very fortunate to be at an organization in an early stage and even my career that believed that it was the right thing to do from a consumer standpoint.
Wow. So at that time, and you were in this role, you basically had to create everything from scratch because there was no
blueprint to follow.
There was no blueprint to follow. So everything was kind of tried and we learned from it and we
That's right.
And we moved forward.
That's
Walk
right.
us through some of those learning points.
Well, I mean, like you said, it's a lot of trial and error. So I was asked to start a diversity committee in 2006. I didn't know what a diversity committee did, was responsible for, needed to accomplish, right? So I'm with a blank sheet of paper, I'm writing a charter and a mission statement and goals for a diversity committee. And there are things that I didn't have a blueprint for. So it was very much trial and error. But what I knew is that there were voices in our company, particularly those that are cable installers, right? They're out there in the field, they're talking to customers, our sales folks, that had a perspective that maybe we weren't leveraging. And what I decided was to do some focus groups, leveraging those voices. And those folks ended up coming up with the Hispanic channel lineup for Time Warner Cable. It's called Paquetazo. We got them together and asked questions like, what do your families like to watch? Go home and ask your families, what do they want to see on TV? What do they like to, what type of programming do they like to see? And we collated all that information, put it with our programmers and our, developers, and came up with a new product for Time Warner Cable. So the benefits of leveraging perspectives that you may not always hear from can actually create, from an innovative standpoint, a new product or service. So there's so many benefits to diversity, equity, and inclusion when it's done right and leveraged in an appropriate way.
Yeah. So the initiative today, it starts from here. They issue all the statements. They include every buzz phrase and all of these kinds of things. And I've often thought the same thing. I said, so how did you come about that? Is it because of something you read, or do you feel this deep down inside? if we bring this person in, this person's going to get vote exposure that come from the board. How do you take it from there down to the installer? Because when you mention install, that's probably the lowest point on the org chart.
Yeah.
And they drove that. They gave you insights from that. But see, lots of people would not have been as astute enough to say, let me go to the people who look like that and get that insight from them.
That's right.
How would you advise these new leaders coming in and they've got the mandate and buzzwords and all these kind of things? So, okay, now I've got to get the job done.
I think listening is so important. Sometimes in these spaces, particularly when we're the underrepresented talent or someone who's been marginalized, we think our lived experiences are maybe the experiences of everyone. And we have to listen to the various lived experiences to understand that they may be different. Or if we're a leader that is in a majority situation, a majority kind of navigating spaces and very influential in an organization, they may think the way I live at this company is how everyone lives at this company. Or I'm an executive, but all the hourly people are treated just like I am. They have the same benefits. And we know that's not true. Yeah. So listening is so important, whether you're a board or an executive or a new diversity leader. Listening to the lived experiences of all of your populations and believing those experiences to be true. Yeah. Sometimes it's so easy to say, you've heard about an experience and someone's dealing with microaggressions. And if you've never dealt with a microaggression in an organization, your first reaction might be, well, I've never experienced that. Yeah. But just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean the person that's telling you that story, it took so much courage for them to tell you that story and to talk about it and openly and to give you the details, likely hoping that you'll help to resolve it. So if your reaction is, well, I've never seen that person that way, or I've never experienced that, then you're diminishing that person's lived experiences and you're probably silencing them in the process. So listening is one of the critical, components, but also then helping to dismantle some of these, some of the structural, systemic injustices that are experienced in our communities and then brought into our companies, right? Because we're bringing our human brains into these companies every day. So when you're a person of influence, a board or an executive or the diversity leader who wants to be heard as well, you have to make sure that you're open to hearing about experiences, even if they're painful to listen to, and then figure out what policy do we need to change? How do we need to recruit people differently? Should we be going to different schools or recruiting and sourcing talent in different ways so that we can get different folks in the door? And then once we get them in the door, how do we take advantage and leverage all the skills they bring to bear versus telling them how we want them to operate? How do we really take advantage and leverage all of those skills that they have?
You make it sound so simple. You make it sound so simple.
I know.
And then when I read and follow discussions and all that, I'm like, what are you missing here?
I know.
It's like, it's not that complicated. But go ahead.
Oh, I just said it shouldn't be.
Yes. So let's go back to the listening part. So I can listen both ways. I can listen to this group here, plus one or whatever, and plus the board, and then I listen going all the way down the lowest part of the org chart. So if I serve as that kind of nucleus, I've got to take in information, and then I can kind of formulate in doing that. But if I concentrate on the plus ones above me, and I may realize that it's a lot of just window dressing, and there's no really concern about really going deep to do this. And I've heard from a lot of people in this role that have found themselves in that situation and eventually left because there was no commitment from on high, so to speak.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. The average tenure of a diversity leader nowadays is between 18 months and, 2.5 years, because at some point you recognize the organization may not have the organizational readiness to hear the real experiences and to actually do something about those experiences. Again, dismantling processes. maybe even removing someone from an organization that's not healthy for the organization. Maybe someone that's not role modeling inclusive behaviors. Maybe practices that have been practiced for so long, but no one recognizes how harmful they've been until a new set of fresh eyes comes in and says, wow, you've been doing this for 6 or 7 years, but you might not recognize the negative consequences of these behaviors because no one's felt comfortable talking to you about the negative consequences. They've just left, right? They just left the organization saying, well, it's not for me. So you've actually never heard about how harmful it is.
I got a flashback when you talked about the so-called leaders that are out of control, that's creating a lot of the microaggressions, but they drive a lot of business. Their revenue streams is large, and we don't want to
shock the boat.
So the phrase is, well, you know how Ron is. You know how Ron is. He's serious about the business, but he's creating turmoil, and everybody's leaving, and he's hard charging, totally clueless to what's going on around him. How would you advise a CEO that came to you with an issue like that, and they're trying to make sense of it? Basically, they don't have the courage to do what they need to do.
I would provide data, right? Do you know that the turnover in this department is 67%? Do you know that every ethnically diverse hire that's come into this department for the last 2 years has left in less than 1 year? Are you aware that the managers on this team are living in fear and operating in fear? How do you think that might be affecting productivity? Did you know that the engagement scores on this team are XYZ? I mean, sometimes you have to bring data, but that person, that leader, that CEO has to have an inclusive mindset and be ready to tackle the consequences and with some intentionality, because this person is being looked at as the person that can help solve this harmful, situation. So everyone's looking to you as the CEO, the executive team, the leadership team to help, to help break up this potentially explosive situation. Everyone's looking to you. So if you don't move in an expeditious way to help kind of dismantle or remove the harmful situation, you are communicating to everyone that's impacted or watching, they're not taking this seriously. And that's when people make the decision, this organization is for me, or maybe it's not for me. And you may lose some really good talent and have some regrettable turnover, all because of a problem that you could have resolved just by having a conversation.
But that's called being a leader.
That's what being a leader is all about.
Yeah, it's not all the good days. As we were talking earlier, everything looks good on top, but you don't get down to the bottom of it. The minutia you've got to deal with under that. So you brought two things in. You mentioned evidence-based, and you brought that in. You kind of alluded to financials, the disruption financially because if the department is not engaged, it's not being productive. So there's a kind of a business case behind it. Is that another driving point to make sure that DEI is built in as a structure within an organization? Because
absolutely.
There's a component to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because so many people talk about the business case for DEI, the business case for DEI. I'm glad that you didn't phrase it that way, because if we're in an organization where we're still talking about making a business case in 2022 for even standing up and activating DEI, then I'm not confident that organization is as progressive and forward thinking as it should be around, global mindset and talent and growth. But with regard to financial metrics in their relation to DEI, absolutely. A DEI strategy needs to have some metrics. So progress on diversity representation goals will always be important, but we should expect that those goals will evolve and better reflect the company's long-term business and DEI strategy with metrics such as, employee survey results, which we've talked about, but maybe spend with diverse-owned suppliers or new DEI-related products and services, as I just mentioned, or a shift in defining exactly how much pay is at risk based on DEI performance, because that really reinforces that this is a priority and provides some additional accountability. The most common, if I can think about this, the most common weighting of DEI metrics is kind of the short-term incentive or long-term incentive with regards to compensation. It's typically averaging at about 10%. And so quantifying the impact on pay is considered more transparent from a shareholder perspective. And the pay affected is viewed as more strongly performance-based. So then thoughtful disclosure on how specific DI incentive metrics and targets really comport with the company's long-term strategy and positively impact shareholder value. So I love to see the connection between DI metrics, compensation, incentives, and shareholder value, because I do think there's a direct correlation.
Yeah, there was a direct correlation. That brought back so many thoughts to me when you mentioned that, because one of the comp schemes that we had at a company we had business verticals, we had e-commerce, we had publishing, all these different variables. But what happened was that part of the compensation scheme was, if I closed the big deal, how many parts of that went over to publishing? How many parts of that went over to e-commerce?
Yes.
And were you able to bring those people in? And the first time I saw that scheme, I said, that's pretty cool, because it doesn't mean that I'm just a hero and I'm just writing all these big numbers and everybody else is suffering. If everyone did that, the entire ship, or in other words, the organization rises.
That's right. How do you cross-collaborate and cross-sell multiple solutions to one client so that you're deepening the relationship with the client, right?
Yeah. So let's take a step back. If I'm coming in as a new so-called DEI expert, I say it in quotes because I always kind of laugh when I see DEI expert is coming in, and I'm going to so-called solve everything. What type of an audit should a new person in this role, to get some evidence to see where we are now, where we are at this point, current state, and where are we headed for future state, and how can I begin to measure that? What are some key points that I should build into my DEI strategies as I'm trying to formulate this thing?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. Number one is, I think your own reporting structure. Who are you reporting into? Just for your own setup for success is important. So if you're reporting into HR, maybe ask for dual reporting into CEO or COO. DEI is not just a people practice, and it should be directly connected to the entire business. As you start thinking about building out your strategy and what you should be focusing on, a DEI audit is the perfect way to gauge where are the gaps, where's the leaky bucket, if you will. And so I think looking at people practices is one. So are there biases within the recruiting process? What does the recruiting process look like? Where are you sourcing talent? What are the strategies? What's your system, your portal that you're using? And does it allow you to have all the functionality and specification around understanding global talent and where you're hiring from and what countries and nationalities and languages are represented? Does it allow you to have a self-identification process so you know who you're bringing in the door, so that when you decide to run some reports and figure out who's in your organization, you have access to that information? So that self-ID campaign is what a lot of diversity leaders are dealing with right now. I would also look at business practices and policies, policies around leave, policies around how products are made, policies around diversity suppliers, policies around how decisions of influence are made, and whether or not you have a position of power to influence those decisions, particularly around a few things. How are layoffs conducted, and what's my role in influencing what that looks like, so that I can make sure we are not impacting one demographic group more than another. In today's society of hybrid, remote, work from home policies, what does that look like? And how does the diversity leader play a role in shaping and informing some of those policies? I can't tell you how many times, both previous and past situations, where maybe there are several people that are saying, I really don't want to go back to the office. I'm afraid of going back to the office. I used to experience microaggressions when I was in the office. I don't want to go. And all that information is filtering into the DEI leader, but the DEI leader may not have a seat at the table at the conversations where they're talking about what are we going to do? When are we going to bring people back? Who should go back? Is it 2 days? Is it 3 days? So if that person doesn't have a voice in the conversation, they're not able to elevate all of the concerns that they've heard. So how are you able to influence some of those key strategies? How are you able to influence succession planning and talent review discussions, performance discussions? At a former company, there were performance rating differentials. And we recognize that some ethnic diverse groups were receiving lower performance ratings, and they were sitting maybe on the same client account than someone else that was doing the same work on that same account. And so how does the diversity leader, to use the phrase, have a seat at the table to influence some of these policies and programs and decisions that could help to shape what the employee value proposition and the employee experience is in an organization? But that audit should also include, in addition to some of the people processes, just, the employee experience. What does that look like? Let me look at your last 3 years of engagement scores, and let me bifurcate that by gender and by race or ethnicity or nationality, so that I can understand the lived experiences and the sentiments of some organizations. Perhaps from a promotion standpoint, a mentorship standpoint, a representation standpoint, there are some issues that we need to uncover. And in many cases, it could be that there are some biases and or implicit associations that make it easier for one group to succeed in the organization than it does for another. So understanding that from the onset can help you with your strategy and how you target programs that will help to mitigate some of those activities.
You just gave a masterclass on the initial audit, a masterclass, because you touched on so many things. I was getting flashbacks. I've been there. Check that off. I've experienced this over my career. So it was cool the way that you talked about all of these kinds of things for that new leader to come in, and it could become so overwhelming that once I got all this data, and it's like I have to climb Mount Everest, because even when it comes to talking through reporting structure, who are you reporting to? So is that something that we should definitely look for if we're looking to get into this kind of an organization as that so-called DEI leader? Reporting structure is should that be a?
It is. Oh yeah. I was talking to a girlfriend recently who's in the interview process, and she said, I was interviewing for this role and I was really excited about it. They're calling the role Chief Diversity Officer, but it was going to report into the HR director. And so she said, I just told them that's not the appropriate reporting structure and I'm not interested. She said they called her 5 months later. The job was still open, and they let her know that the reporting structure changed. It was now going to report into the Chief Sustainability Officer. So yeah, that reporting structure is important because it aligns with the level of influence that you might have. I think ensuring that you'll have access and exposure to the board of directors on a regular basis, not just once a year to report out on something, but pretty consistently. I actually would encourage anyone wanting to get into this space and maybe interviewing now or getting ready to begin interviewing to have informational interviews with different demographic groups in the organization. Ask to speak to, if the company has ERGs that already exist, ask to speak to some of the members of the ERGs. You want to know, what is it like being Hispanic, Asian, Black, LGBT, a veteran, a woman, whatever it is. You want to know what that experience is like. And hopefully those folks will kind of tell you the truth, because that could shape whether or not you accept that offer. Because an interview process is to sell you a role. So everyone typically tells you all the good stuff. Yeah. I love it here.
Yeah.
Right. This is the best company ever. Well, when I'm talking to an executive that's making billions of dollars a year, of course you're going to tell me you love it. I want to know what that person, that hourly person, that customer service person, that retail person, that I want to know what their experience is like. because that might tell me either, number one, what a great opportunity, I can help shift or shape that experience, or number two, I heard so many things that were not positive that I don't know that I can shift it because I don't know if the organizational readiness is really there.
If I were told no, you would not have access to those groups, and I was only given access to people they wanted to give that to me, should that be a sign?
I would think that's a sign. Why would I, as as the CEO, COO, head of HR in an interview process, prevent you from hearing the voices of people you'll be working with anyway if I hire you? I would think that it was a red flag if I couldn't talk to 3 people for 30 minutes that, lead an ERG, there's a member of an ERG, or that has had an experience in the company. Now, they'll probably be choosing the people, so they're going to choose the cheerleaders, right? But I'm going to ask some tough questions. Yeah. I'm going to know that I need to ask, tell me about
for the cheerleaders. You're going to break that down.
I'm going to break that down. How long have you been with the company? How many roles have you had? Oh, you're in the same role that you were hired into 5 years ago. Tell me about the promotion process. Have you been passed over for a promotion? I mean, right? I want to know.
Yeah, you provide scare to in certain organizations, and you came in with those kinds of questions to ask.
But it lets you know what you're getting into.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I noticed here, I did the calculations, 16 years, and you started in this space before it became a space. What was the major learning from that time until 2006? And then you started your own firm, and you've done all this global consulting for all these major brands. Is there some common themes that have kind of come through, specifically as you see the sunrise coming up and all the talk about DEI, something I've been doing for all this time?
You know what I've learned is that not enough has changed. I can recall sitting in meetings in 2018, 2015, and 2011 where the talk track was exactly the same. I literally could have just pulled out an old notebook and said, oh, it's 2018. Well, when I had this exact conversation in 2012 about how we tie in the diversity leader to the talent review conversation and how we disrupt the bias when the person says, well, she can't travel, she just had a child. Well, let's let her make that decision. We don't know what her home life is like, right? I had that conversation in 2011, 2016, 2018. So what I've learned is unfortunately not enough has changed, and that we have so much work to do to help leaders of influence, people who lead teams, understand that benevolent bias. That's what that's an example of, is I think I'm making the right decision for the person I'm helping them, when really you need to just allow that person to make the decision for themselves and present them with the opportunity. These different types of biases, confirmation bias, benevolent bias, the halo and the horn, there's so many different kinds that leaders just don't understand sometimes, that they have a lot to learn around what has shaped their perspectives and how we can help them kind of bust up some of those, bias busters, just kind of bust up some of those biases to give them more of a lens that's more just globally minded, and where they're more well-rounded about the decisions they make and how they bring others along to help their decision-making process. And so when I think about things like, will I ever be able to work myself out of a job? I think this is going to be around for a while because of what I just said. I mean, those same trends, those same themes, and leaders that believe they're doing the best or that they know enough. But I mean, between the trainings that I have, the coaching that, that happens, those conversations with leaders, I personally believe there's still so much to learn in this space.
Yeah, and these are honest conversations that these people need to hear, but not only that, being an active part of. I did a project in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and it was around women empowerment. But the leader of the organization sat in on every monthly meeting because he
Wow.
wanted to have his voice without it being filtered through some kind of
That's right.
update or whatever it was. He
That's
showed
right.
that commitment. And I told him that commitment permeates throughout the organization.
That's right.
People have a chance to sit in the same room with you as if you're some big shot or whatever it is. But
That's
they
right.
had the opportunity to sit in the room, hear your thoughts. You would be able to hear everyone's thought because they felt the level of trust that the organization was building with them. But lots of times, I think leaders are just afraid or they're just on to other things.
And when you're sitting in there listening, which is so wonderful because you're humanizing yourself, I want to know your experience. I want to know how you're feeling.
Yeah.
You can't get defensive about what you're hearing. You have to believe that these are the experiences of folks. And then you have to figure out now, how do I go take my leadership team, my executive team, that's essentially leading every person in the organization, and how do we fix this? How do we resolve it? Knowing that it's not overnight, but how do we resolve some of these issues that we just heard? Because typically when you're hearing some of these issues or when you're doing these listening sessions, think about all the stuff that's happened, these mass shootings here in the United States.
Yeah.
Sometimes targeted, racialized violence, and just all the other things that are going on in our country. Roe versus Wade. I mean, there's so many things happening right now in the United States.
That's why I can't wait to get back to JFK to say, cool, do what you're going to do. I'm out.
I hear you. I can't wait for my international stint at some point because I would love to leave all the chaos.
I know.
But,
So we're going to take a short break now, and we'll come back to we have some closing questions.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Do you have an all-star HR team? You may feel your team is already performing at a high level, but let's take a closer look. Would your company's top leaders and employees agree that your HR team are operating at a high level? Are team members able to influence top executives on difficult topics? Are team members business and strategy focused on the challenges the organization is facing? Does the executive team trust your direct reports as advisors on human capital issues? If you can answer yes to these questions, you have built an outstanding team. If you feel there is room for improvement, Strategy Focused Group can create a custom development program to elevate the quality of your HR team. We use HCI certification programs as well as non-certified HRBP MBA Masterclass to give your team a laser focus on the business and strategy. Please email us at info@strategyfocusedgroup.com.
Welcome back. I read an interview that you gave a while back, and you were talking about the leadership development as a program or as an offsite or whatever it is. And one of the suggestions you made, which I thought was very unique, at every session there should be a discussion around inclusion, diversity, which is never really covered in offsites. And I've done numerous offsites. And we go through we check off all the boxes on strategy cascading, and da da da. But no talk about diversity. This is the big push, but there's nothing from here to bring into. I thought that was a very unique approach, and I said I gotta make a note of that.
Yeah, if I've spent over a decade or longer facilitating leadership development courses, and it's been my experience that when you have a captive audience of influencers, people that make decisions, people that put together teams, people that hire. And the topic maybe on leadership training is performance and talent and maybe how the company makes money. Helping leaders understand the amount of influence they have over the career trajectories of their direct reports and teams they influence. They also need to understand the concept of inclusive leadership. So I'm actually thrilled to pat myself on the back. I have an inclusive leadership course, and Harvard Extension just picked it up. And so I'll be facilitating a 30-hour inclusive leadership course in the fall for Harvard Extension. And I'm really excited about that. That'll be a part of their DEI certification. But this whole notion about navigating leading the organizations, right? So kind of traversing this generational divide, leading in global cultures, understanding the impact of biases on people decisions. It's a must-have in a leadership course. I'm navigating, a global team, crossing time zones. I need to understand when I need to be sensitive. I need to understand global and cultural norms and standards and behaviors. I need to understand why someone is celebrating a holiday in another country that we don't recognize in the US, and it's okay. I need to understand the demands of time and family situations and, just those cultural nuances that I should be aware of as I'm leading a global team. The sensitivity to how decisions are made, the sensitivity to time, the sensitivity to hierarchy. There's so many norms in leading a global team that if you're not giving that skill set, that global mindset to a leader who is charged with making an influence, helping your company make money and making an impact, they should be able to lead inclusively. And I just think if you are getting someone in a classroom for a couple of days or even 8 hours, spend an hour or two, if you can, talking about inclusion and inclusive leadership. It's very, very critical.
Yeah. You'd be surprised. And then again, you probably would not be surprised how many global organizations that have offices, say, in the APAC region, Middle East, or whatever it is, and they develop these policies from a U.S. perspective.
U.S.-centric. Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be it, and there's no deviation from the other side.
And have the nerve to call themselves a global organization.
But I think of this. I think of the people that's in charge of this. So the courses you're talking about, they need to be a part of that.
That's right.
Because how do you penetrate another culture? How do you even understand the mindset? One of the things about Dubai companies, they will always talk about how many languages are spoken inside of their organizations.
That's right.
They'll always talk about how many nationalities are embedded inside of the organizations. But I think the American mindset tends to block out everything else.
Absolutely. And if you're in certain Asian countries, and actually even Germany, the word diversity, I don't know if it's the word diversity or the word inclusion, but one of those words doesn't even translate well. So you have to talk about it in localized language that makes sense, right? In certain Asian countries, if you talk about diversity, it doesn't always resonate. I remember traveling back and forth in a previous company quite a bit to Hong Kong, and we had to kind of change the way we talked about it. Inclusion is understood, right? But if you talk about diversity in certain Chinese or countries or Hong Kong, it doesn't always translate directly.
Yes.
And you have to speak the language of the country, not speak the language formally, but use words that are easily translatable so that the folks that you're speaking to in your audience can understand the concepts, because they're already, if English isn't the first language, they're already trying to translate. So now I'm using words that don't easily translate. So that person is still struggling on 3 sentences ago, and I'm moving forward, which means now I've lost their attention. So you have to be mindful when you're in these global and have a global mindset. I remember when I was delivering a presentation to a group of people in the Philippines, and I was sitting in the US and everyone else was in the Philippines, and someone sent me an instant message and said, talk slower. Remember that they're interpreting while they're listening. So I put that in my head and I've never forgotten it. Yeah. When you're speaking to a group of people where English is not their first language, yes. They're in the translation process while they're hearing you talk. Exactly. So if you speak more slowly, they can translate in real time, and then you're not losing them in the process. So notice how I just slowed down my cadence. So some of these things are really important.
I was told the same thing. And a lot of my work is out of the Philippines. A lot of my work is based out of the Philippines. Vast majority of my work is out of the APAC region. But see, what you do from my side is that you listen. You talked about listening.
Yeah.
You listen to that feedback. But my challenge is the HQ concept. If it's baked in the U.S., specifically the Philippines, they have every country, every organization for the most part has some base in the Philippines.
Right.
And they don't listen to their culture. They don't listen to the norms of the Philippines, and they just create policy. and it just causes so much disruption. But because of the mindset, they are a little afraid about even presenting that as an issue.
That's right, because of their training and upbringing around hierarchy.
Exactly.
Right? So, yeah.
Global mindset. Thank you. So I knew it was going to be great. So thank you so much for being a part of it. We're going to get you out on time. I know you have some errands to run. And thank you for making time on this Friday to be a part of the CEO series.
This was so fun. Thank you very much for having me, Ron. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Hold on for a second as we close out.